Welcome to a special boring history episode where we journey together into the shadowed corridors of power along the banks of the ancient Nile. Picture, if you will, a land where the sun blazed eternal over golden deserts and life-giving river valleys, where colossal monuments pierced the heavens and the scent of frankincense drifted through marble halls. This is ancient Egypt. A civilization that has captivated our imaginations for millennia with its dazzling triumphs and shocking abuses, its divine splendor and all-too-human darkness. Before we descend into the tomb-like chambers of pharaonic power, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop a comment below. Are you nestled in bed in London as the rain patters against your window? Perhaps you're watching the sun set over the American plains, or greeting the dawn in Tokyo. And if this is your first time joining our community of history enthusiasts, consider subscribing to journey with us through the forgotten corridors of the past. Tonight we explore one of history's most fascinating contradictions, the Pharaohs of Egypt. Beings who were worshipped as living gods, yet tormented by the very mortality they sought to transcend. Behind the golden death masks and towering pyramids lay lives of paranoia, incestuous obsession, and desperate attempts to maintain power that would make even the most ambitious modern politician recoil in horror. Let's set the stage, shall we? For over 3,000 years, the pharaohs ruled from their palaces as divine intermediaries between the mortal realm and the eternal cosmos. They were not merely kings. They were gods walking among mortals, their very breath believed to control the annual flooding of the Nile that brought life to the desert. Yet this divinity came at a price that few could bear without their souls becoming twisted by the weight of absolute power. Imagine yourself in the heart of Memphis during the Old Kingdom. Around 2600 BC, the air shimmers with heat as slaves drag massive limestone blocks toward the construction site of yet another pharaoh's eternal resting place. In the royal palace nearby, the pharaoh sits upon his golden throne, surrounded by courtiers who prostrate themselves so low that their foreheads touch the polished stone floor. They dare not look upon his face directly, for to gaze upon a god uninvited meant death. The pharaoh's every word is law, his every whim a divine command that must be obeyed without question. But behind this facade of omnipotence lay minds often warped by isolation, inbreeding, and the crushing responsibility of maintaining cosmic order. The pharaohs lived in a world where trust was a luxury they could not afford, where every meal might contain poison, every advisor might harbor treasonous thoughts, and every heir represented both salvation and potential usurpation. We'll explore the disturbing reality behind the divine facade, delving into the incestuous marriages designed to preserve royal bloodlines, the brutal methods used to maintain power, and the psychological toll of ruling as a living god. From the paranoid courts of the Middle Kingdom to the decadent excess of Ptolemaic rule, we'll uncover how absolute power transformed these supposed deities into some of history's most troubled rulers. Let's begin by examining the foundation upon which all pharaonic power rested, the terrifying concept of divine kingship and its psychological consequences. The ancient Egyptians believed their pharaoh was the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed god, and would become Osiris, ruler of the underworld, upon death. This wasn't merely a political fiction, it was a religious truth that penetrated every aspect of Egyptian society. The pharaoh's divine nature meant that opposing him wasn't just treason. It was cosmic blasphemy that threatened the very order of the universe. Consider the psychological impact of being raised from birth to believe you are literally a god. Pharaohs were isolated from ordinary human contact, surrounded by elaborate rituals that reinforced their otherworldly status. They were carried everywhere in golden sedan chairs because their feet were too sacred to touch common ground. Their food was prepared by specially purified servants, and served on plates of gold and silver. Even their urine and feces were considered sacred, Some pharaohs employed servants whose sole duty was to collect and properly dispose of royal waste according to religious protocol. This isolation bred a profound disconnection from human empathy. When Pharaoh Pepi II, who ruled for over 90 years during the 6th dynasty, grew bored with traditional entertainment, he reportedly ordered that honey be smeared on naked slaves so he could watch flies torment them during his meal. The screams of these unfortunate souls served as background music for royal dining, while courtiers were expected to maintain pleasant conversation, as if nothing unusual was occurring. The burden of maintaining cosmic order also manifested in disturbing ways. Pharaohs believed that their personal health and virility directly affected the fertility of Egypt itself. When a pharaoh showed signs of aging or illness, palace physicians would sometimes recommend increasingly extreme measures. Some rulers consumed concoctions made from human blood, believing it would restore their vitality. Others subjected themselves to painful rituals involving the insertion of golden rods into their bodies, thinking this would channel divine energy. The practice of royal incest, while often discussed in academic terms, reveals itself in all its disturbing detail when we examine specific cases. The pharaohs believed that only royal blood could produce worthy heirs, leading to marriages between brothers and sisters, fathers and daughters, and even mothers and sons. These unions weren't occasional political expedients. They were systematic breeding programs designed to concentrate divine essence. Pharaoh Amenhotep II, who ruled during the 18th dynasty, married not only his sister but also his daughter by that marriage. Court records describe elaborate wedding ceremonies where the young princess bride, often no more than 12 years old, would be presented to her father-husband dressed as the goddess Isis. The psychological trauma inflicted on these children, raised to view such arrangements as divinely ordained, is impossible to comprehend fully from our modern perspective. The genetic consequences of these practices were catastrophic. Modern DNA analysis of royal mummies has revealed a catalog of hereditary disorders that plagued pharaonic bloodline. Akhenaten, the revolutionary pharaoh who temporarily abandoned Egypt's traditional gods, suffered from what appears to have been Marfan syndrome, causing his distinctive elongated features and possible gender ambiguity. His son Tutankhamun, born of a union between Akhenaten and his sister, died at 18 with a clubfoot, spina bifida, and numerous other genetic defects that made walking without assistance nearly impossible. The court physicians of the time were powerless against these hereditary ailments, often resorting to increasingly desperate measures. They prescribed medications made from ground human bones, believing that consuming the remains of healthy commoners might strengthen the weakened royal constitution. When young pharaohs died from their genetic burdens, court officials would sometimes attempt to conceal the death for months, using elaborate cosmetics and strategic positioning to create the illusion that the god-king still lived. Palace intrigue reached levels of Byzantine complexity, as various factions maneuvered for power around these often sickly rulers. The pharaoh's isolation made him dependent on intermediaries who filtered all information reaching the throne. These advisors wielded enormous influence, sometimes effectively ruling in the pharaoh's name while keeping him drugged or distracted with increasingly exotic pleasure. Queen Nefertiti, Akhenaten's primary wife, apparently recognized the dysfunction of the royal court and attempted to seize power directly. Ancient texts suggest she may have poisoned several rival wives and even her own stepdaughter to eliminate threats to her position. When Akhenaten's health declined, she began appearing in official artwork wearing the pharaoh's crown and false beard, essentially ruling as a female pharaoh while her husband slowly died in isolation. The paranoia that consumed these divine rulers manifested in increasingly elaborate security measures. Pharaoh Ramesses III, haunted by assassination attempts, employed food tasters for every meal and required that all court officials undergo ritual purification before entering his presence. His bedchamber was protected by multiple layers of guards, who were rotated randomly to prevent conspiracy formation. Despite these precautions, Palace records indicate he was ultimately murdered by one of his wives in a plot involving dozens of courtiers. The process of succession often revealed the most disturbing aspects of pharaonic power. When a pharaoh died, his wives and concubines were sometimes entombed alive alongside him, believed necessary to serve him in the afterlife. Archaeological evidence from several tombs suggests these women were given sedatives before burial, but not enough to render them unconscious. They were buried in a twilight state between sleep and death, aware enough to experience their fate but unable to resist. The preparation of royal mummies itself involved procedures that would horrify modern sensibilities. The pharaoh's internal organs were removed through small incisions, with the brain extracted through the nose using long bronze hooks. But for pharaohs who died violently or under suspicious circumstances, the embalmers sometimes took grisly liberties with the process. Several royal mummies show evidence of deliberate disfigurement during mummification, suggesting that even in death, some pharaohs fell victim to the vengeful hatred of their subjects. Palace life for the living pharaohs was a strange mixture of ultimate luxury and profound psychological torment. They dined on delicacies imported from across the known world, dates from Nubia, wine from the Levant, exotic spices from mysterious lands beyond the horizon. Yet they ate in enforced silence, surrounded by servants who were forbidden to speak unless addressed. The loneliness must have been overwhelming for rulers who possessed everything except genuine human connection. The pharaoh's attempts to find companionship often led to disturbing relationships with their subjects. Some rulers developed obsessive attachments to particular slaves or courtiers, elevating them to positions of enormous power, while demanding absolute personal devotion. When these favorites inevitably disappointed their divine masters, or grew too ambitious, their falls were spectacular and brutal. Palace walls bore witness to executions, tortures, and humiliations that were as much about the pharaoh's emotional devastation as they were about maintaining political control. Religious obligations provided another source of psychological pressure. The pharaoh was expected to perform daily rituals to maintain cosmic balance, including ceremonies that required him to commune with statues of gods in darkened temple chambers. These rituals often involved hours of chanting, fasting, and exposure to mind-altering substances that were believed to facilitate divine communication. The line between religious ecstasy and mental breakdown was often unclear, particularly for pharaohs already struggling with the isolation of absolute power. Modern forensic analysis of royal mummies has revealed fascinating and disturbing details about pharaonic health and lifestyle. CT scans of Ramesses II, one of Egypt's most celebrated pharaohs, show evidence of severe arthritis that would have made movement extremely painful in his later years. Yet historical records show him continuing to lead military campaigns and public ceremonies well into his 80s, suggesting he endured constant agony to maintain the illusion of divine vigor. The mummy of Pharaoh Seqenenre, who ruled during the Second Intermediate Period, tells an even more harrowing story. His skull shows multiple traumatic injuries that forensic experts have matched to specific weapons: battle axes, spears, and daggers. The wounds suggest he was captured alive and tortured extensively before being killed. The positioning of the injuries indicates his captors deliberately prolonged his suffering, perhaps as ritual humiliation of a fallen god king. Perhaps no pharaoh's remains tell a more disturbing story than those of the mysterious rulers found in tomb KV55, in the Valley of the Kings. Initially thought to be Akhenaten himself, the mummy shows signs of deliberate vandalism during the mummification process. The face was smashed, the royal cartouches were removed from the coffin, and the body was treated with unusual chemicals that caused accelerated decomposition. Someone wanted to ensure this pharaoh's journey to the afterlife would be as nightmarish as possible. The political machinations within royal families often descended into levels of cruelty that shocked even ancient observers. When Pharaoh Ptolemy the Third seized power in 1405 BCE, he systematically eliminated potential rivals within his own family. Historical accounts describe how he forced his brother's wife to watch as their children were dismembered alive, then compelled her to eat their flesh before ordering her own execution. These weren't acts of momentary rage, they were calculated demonstrations of power designed to terrorize potential opposition into absolute submission. The pharaoh's obsession with immortality led to increasingly desperate attempts to cheat death. Some rulers experimented with primitive forms of what we might now recognize as organ transplants, using slaves as unwilling donors for hearts, livers, and other organs. While these procedures invariably failed, they demonstrate the lengths to which pharaohs would go to maintain their earthly power. Palace physicians developed increasingly complex theories about preserving life force, often involving the consumption of rare substances believed to possess magical properties. Gold dust mixed with wine was a common pharaonic remedy for various ailments, as was mercury, which we now know to be highly toxic. Some pharaohs developed mercury poisoning that manifested as violent mood swings, paranoia, and hallucinations, symptoms that courtiers were forced to interpret as divine visions rather than signs of poisoning. The relationship between pharaohs and their subjects was fundamentally built on terror disguised as reverence. Public appearances were carefully choreographed spectacles designed to reinforce the ruler's divine nature while demonstrating the consequences of disobedience. When Pharaoh Amenhotep III held court, condemned prisoners were sometimes flayed alive in his presence, their skin used to create drumheads for royal ceremonies. The sound of these human skin drums accompanied religious festivals, a constant reminder of the pharaoh's power over life and death. The architectural monuments that inspire awe today were built on foundations of human suffering that defies imagination. The Great Pyramid of Giza required the labor of an estimated 100,000 workers over 20 years. While some were paid laborers, many were slaves captured in military campaigns or debtors sold to satisfy obligations. Recent excavations near the pyramid have uncovered mass graves containing thousands of workers who died during construction, evidence of the human cost of pharaonic immortality projects. Worker remains show signs of severe malnutrition, repetitive stress, injuries, and untreated broken bones. Some skeletons bear marks suggesting workers were literally worked to death, then replaced without ceremony. The pharaohs viewed these deaths not as tragedies but as necessary sacrifices to their eternal glory, no different from the cattle and grain offered to the gods in temple ceremonies. The pharaoh's relationship with death became increasingly complex and disturbing over the dynasties. They spent decades preparing for their own deaths, while simultaneously ordering the deaths of countless others. Some rulers maintained detailed lists of who would be executed upon their demise: wives, servants, pets, and even favored courtiers who were deemed too valuable to leave behind for potential rivals. When Pharaoh Jar died around 3000 BCE, archaeological evidence suggests that 38 servants were buried alive in his tomb complex. These weren't quick deaths. The arrangement of the bodies indicates the servants were sealed in chambers with limited air supplies, dying slowly as they served their master's final needs. Similar practices continued sporadically throughout pharaonic history, with some rulers specifically requesting that their deaths be accompanied by maximum suffering from those around them. The sexual practices within pharaonic courts would scandalize even the most libertine modern observers. Beyond the well-documented incestuous marriages, pharaohs often maintained harems of hundreds of concubines who existed solely for royal pleasure. These women lived in luxurious prisons, pampered and adorned like precious objects, but denied any agency over their own lives. They were bought, sold, and traded like commodities, with the most beautiful reserved for the pharaoh's exclusive use. Court records from the 19th dynasty describe disturbing rituals involving these concubines. Some pharaohs required their women to participate in ceremonies where they role-played as various goddesses, complete with animal costumes and masks. These performances often involved degrading acts that were justified as religious observances but served primarily to satisfy the pharaoh's psychological need for absolute dominance over every aspect of life around him. The children born from these unions faced uncertain fate. Royal bastards could never threaten the succession, so they were often raised as ornamental court figures, educated in arts and letters but forbidden from developing any real power or influence. Some pharaohs took perverse pleasure in watching their illegitimate children compete for minor royal favors, creating elaborate competitions where siblings were forced to humiliate themselves for their father's amusement. Modern forensic science has provided disturbing insights into pharaonic medical practices. X-ray analysis of royal mummies reveals evidence of primitive surgical procedures performed on living pharaohs. Some skulls show signs of trepanation, holes drilled into the skull while the patient was alive, supposedly to release evil spirits, but more likely attempts to treat symptoms of the mercury poisoning or genetic disorders that plagued royal bloodline. The mummy of Pharaoh Amenhotep III shows evidence of multiple surgeries performed during his lifetime, including what appears to be an attempt to remove a brain tumor through the nasal cavity. The crude nature of these procedures, combined with the lack of effective anesthesia, means the pharaoh would have endured unimaginable agony while remaining conscious throughout. That he survived multiple such operations speaks to either remarkable physical resilience or the terrifying loyalty of physicians who dared not allow their divine patient to die under their care. Perhaps the most psychologically revealing aspect of pharaonic life was their obsession with controlling not just the present but the eternal future. They spent fortunes on tomb construction and mummification, but also on more sinister preparations for the afterlife. Some pharaohs arranged for the kidnapping and mummification of foreign royalty, believing that having other rulers' mummies in their tomb complexes would ensure their dominance continued into eternity. Pharaoh Ramesses II commissioned artisans to create miniature mummified armies, thousands of tiny soldier figures, each individually wrapped and blessed to serve him in the afterlife. But he also ordered the creation of mummified prisoners of war, captured enemies who were tortured to death, then preserved in degrading positions to serve as eternal slaves. These grisly collections reveal a mindset that viewed all life as existing solely for royal convenience, even beyond death. The decline of pharaonic power often brought out the worst in these divine rulers. As Egypt faced increasing pressure from foreign invasions and internal rebellions, some pharaohs responded with escalating brutality that horrified even their own supporters. Pharaoh Epres, facing military defeats in the 6th century BCE, reportedly ordered the mass execution of anyone who had shown insufficient enthusiasm for his campaigns. Entire families were wiped out based on anonymous accusations of disloyalty. When external enemies finally conquered Egypt, they often found palace complexes that resembled chambers of horrors more than centers of government. Persian invaders described discovering rooms filled with instruments of tortures, chambers where dissected human bodies were displayed as warnings to potential traitors, and libraries containing detailed records of executions, mutilations, and psychological torments inflicted on anyone who had displeased the pharaoh. The gradual revelation of these disturbing details through modern archaeology has forced historians to confront uncomfortable truths about ancient Egyptian civilization. The society that produced magnificent art, revolutionary architecture, and sophisticated literature also enabled some of humanity's most systematic cruelty. The same culture that developed complex moral and ethical codes simultaneously worshipped rulers whose behavior would be considered psychopathic by any modern standard. Recent discoveries in the Valley of the Kings have provided even more unsettling evidence of pharaonic activity. In 2017, ground-penetrating radar revealed hidden chambers in several tombs that appear to contain mass burials of court officials. Carbon dating suggests these people died simultaneously with their pharaohs, likely victims of succession purges designed to prevent the revelation of royal secrets. One particularly disturbing find involved the tomb of a previously unknown pharaoh from the 3rd Intermediate Period. The burial chamber contained not only the ruler's mummy but also the preserved remains of 12 children, ages ranging from infancy to adolescence. Analysis of their remains suggests they died from poisoning, likely administered simultaneously. Their positioning around the pharaoh's sarcophagus,
along with hieroglyphic inscriptions describing them as eternal companions, suggests these children were sacrificed to accompany their divine master into the afterlife. DNA analysis of royal mummies has revealed genetic evidence of the extreme inbreeding that characterized Pharaonic dynasty. Several pharaohs show genetic markers indicating their parents were closely related siblings, resulting in coefficient of inbreeding higher than those typically found in isolated populations that have suffered severe genetic bottlenecks. This genetic concentration led not only to physical deformities, but likely to severe cognitive and emotional disturbances that manifested as the cruel behaviors recorded in ancient texts. The most genetically compromised pharaohs often displayed the most extreme behavior. Tutankhamun's genetic analysis reveals multiple serious disorders that would have caused constant pain and cognitive impairment. Yet court records suggest he ordered increasingly elaborate executions and tortures, perhaps as a way of asserting power he felt slipping away due to his physical limitation. His death mask, while beautiful to modern eyes, was crafted to conceal facial deformities that would have made him appear monstrous to his subject.
The psychological toll of pharaonic power becomes most apparent in the later dynasties, when Greek influence began penetrating Egyptian culture. Pharaohs like Ptolemy IV, exposed to Greek philosophy and more egalitarian political concepts, struggled with profound existential crises about the nature of their divinity. Palace writings describe rulers who alternated between megalomaniacal displays of power and periods of deep depression where they questioned the fundamental basis of their authority. Some pharaohs attempted to reconcile their divine status with growing philosophical doubts by creating elaborate theological justifications for their cruelty. They commissioned scholarly works explaining how their harsh treatment of subjects was actually a form of divine mercy, preparing their victims' souls for better lives in the afterlife. These texts reveal minds desperately trying to rationalize behaviors they perhaps recognized as monstrous, but felt compelled to continue by the weight of tradition and expectation. The end of pharaonic power, when it finally came, often brought its own horrors. The last native pharaoh, Nectanebo II, fled Egypt when Persian forces approached his capital. Rather than face capture, he reportedly poisoned his entire household, wives, children, servants, and even pets, believing that death by his hand was preferable to life under foreign rule. This final act of absolute control over life and death epitomized the disturbing psychology that had characterized pharaonic rule for millennia. Modern analysis of royal tombs has also revealed evidence of post-mortem mutilation performed by grave robbers and political enemies. Some pharaohs' mummies show deliberate damage inflicted centuries after death, suggesting that their reputations for cruelty motivated people to seek revenge even against their preserved remains. Fingers were broken, faces smashed, and magical amulets stolen not just for their material value but as acts of symbolic violence against rulers whose memories inspired hatred even across generations. The discovery of administrative papyri has provided unprecedented insight into the daily operations of pharaonic courts. These documents reveal bureaucratic systems designed to maximize the ruler's control over every aspect of his subjects' lives while insulating him from the consequences of his decision. Orders for mass executions were processed with the same administrative efficiency as requests for temple offerings, creating institutional mechanisms that made systematic cruelty possible on an industrial scale. One particularly chilling document from the reign of Ramesses IV describes the selection process for royal human sacrifices. Palace officials maintained detailed records of potential victims, categorizing them by age, physical condition, and social status. The pharaoh could browse these lists like a modern catalog, selecting individuals for various ceremonial deaths based on his mood or the requirements of particular religious festivals. The international relationships of pharaohs also reflected their disturbing worldview. Diplomatic correspondence with foreign rulers reveals Egyptian pharaohs who casually requested shipments of foreign slaves, exotic animals for their private menageries, and even foreign royalty to serve as hostages or entertainment. When these requests were refused, pharaohs sometimes responded with military campaigns designed not to conquer territory but to capture specific individuals who had attracted their attention. The famous diplomatic marriage between Pharaoh Ramesses II and a Hittite princess was accompanied by negotiations over how many Hittite slaves would be included in her dowry. The princess herself was essentially a peace offering, her value measured not in political alliance but in her potential to produce heirs who might inherit both Egyptian and Hittite thrones. When she died in childbirth, as recorded in palace documents, Ramesses II reportedly expressed disappointment, not for her death but for the political opportunities lost with her demise. Archaeological evidence suggests that pharaonic courts developed increasingly sophisticated methods of psychological torture that left no physical traces. Victims were subjected to sensory deprivation, forced to witness the torture of loved ones, or kept in states of uncertainty about their fate for months or years. These techniques were particularly favored for dealing with captured foreign nobles whose deaths might provoke international incidents but whose suffering could serve as private entertainment for the pharaoh. The religious festivals that celebrated pharaonic power often included public displays of cruelty that served both to honor the gods and terrorize the population. During the Opet festival, celebrated annually in Thebes, captured enemies were sometimes burned alive in elaborate ceremonies while the pharaoh and his court feasted nearby. The contrast between the magnificent religious processions and these brutal executions created a psychological atmosphere where beauty and horror became inextricably linked in the popular consciousness. As pharaonic power waned during the late period, some rulers attempted to restore their authority through increasingly desperate displays of divine power. Pharaoh Necho II, facing pressure from Babylonian forces, ordered the construction of a canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea, a massive engineering project that required the deaths of an estimated. When construction delays threatened the project's completion, Necho reportedly ordered that workers' families be brought to the construction site and executed in front of their loved ones to motivate faster progress. The final pharaohs ruling under Roman oversight often became caricatures of their predecessors, maintaining the external trappings of divine power while serving essentially as puppet rulers. These last pharaohs sometimes compensated for their political impotence through even more extreme personal cruelties, as if inflicting suffering on those around them could restore some sense of their lost omnipotence. Cleopatra VII, the last active pharaoh, combined traditional pharaonic ruthlessness with Greek sophistication to create new forms of psychological manipulation. She reportedly maintained detailed psychological profiles of potential allies and enemies, using this information to craft elaborate deceptions and betrayals that served her political goals. Her famous romantic relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were calculated political performances, with every gesture and word carefully designed to maintain her power through personal control over these powerful men. When her political position became untenable following the Battle of Actium, Cleopatra chose suicide rather than submission to Roman rule, but even in death she maintained pharaonic traditions of control and spectacle. She tested various poisons on condemned slaves to ensure her own death would be both quick and aesthetically pleasing, viewing even her final moments as a performance requiring careful staging. The legacy of pharaonic rule extends far beyond ancient Egypt, influencing concepts of absolute power and divine kingship that would plague humanity for millennia. The notion that rulers could claim divine authority to justify unlimited cruelty provided a template that would be adopted by emperors, kings, and dictators throughout history. Understanding the disturbing reality behind pharaonic power helps us recognize similar patterns in other civilizations and perhaps guard against their re-emergence. Modern Egypt struggles with this complex historical inheritance. The magnificent monuments that attract millions of tourists each year,
stand as testaments to both remarkable human achievement and systematic human suffering. The same pharaohs whose tombs we explore with wonder were responsible for levels of cruelty that challenge our understanding of human nature itself. Recent technological advances continue to reveal new details about pharaonic life that confirm its disturbing nature. Chemical analysis of royal mummies has detected traces of exotic toxins that suggest some pharaohs experimented with mind-altering substances that may have contributed to their erratic behavior. Isotope analysis of bone samples reveals dietary patterns indicating that some pharaohs consumed human flesh, possibly as part of religious ceremonies or simply as expressions of their power over life and death. The psychological profiles that emerge from these scientific investigations paint pictures of individuals whose minds were warped by absolute power from earliest childhood. Raised in isolation, surrounded by sycophants and burdened with impossible expectations of divinity, these rulers developed personality disorders that manifested as systematic cruelty toward everyone around them. Their subjects, meanwhile, were trapped in a system that demanded they worship the very individuals who tormented them, creating a civilization-wide psychological dysfunction that persisted for thousands of years. As we reach the end of our journey through the shadowed halls of pharaonic power, we're left to contemplate one of history's most disturbing paradoxes. The same civilization that gave us magnificent art, revolutionary mathematics, and profound wisdom about the human condition also produced rulers whose cruelty shocked even their contemporaries. The pharaohs were both gods and monsters, creators and destroyers, visionaries and psychopaths, living contradictions whose legacy continues to haunt our understanding of power and human nature. Thank you for spending your evening with me in the company of these long-dead god-kings, exploring the darkness that lurked behind their golden mask. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you'll reflect on how the pursuit of absolute power inevitably corrupts even those who begin with noble intentions, and how the greatest monuments to human achievement often cast the longest shadows. Sweet dream, and may your rest be more peaceful than that of the pharaohs who even in death could find no escape from the ghosts of their earthly cruelties, forever wandering the shadowed pathways between the realm of the living and the kingdom of the dead, where the weight of their golden crowns became chains that bound them to an eternity of restless contemplation among the whispering sands of ancient Egypt. Good